Welcome, everyone, to another episode of HR and Payroll 2.0. I'm Pete Tiliakis, and as always, I'm joined by the legendary Julie Fernandez. Welcome, Julie.
Thanks, Pete. And I'm excited to be here because we're going to be talking about hope on a Friday.
I know. I'm excited to have Marcus Mossberger. Marcus, welcome to the show. I'm excited to have you join us.
Thanks, Pete.
Yeah. So look, Julie, you want to do the honors? We always kind of get started by getting to know the guest. And in this case, we want to make sure the audience is familiar with you. So, Julie, do the honors.
Yeah, so we're recognizing a pattern here, Mark, but what we wonder actually intrinsically is, how did you get into this world of HR payroll, talent, all the stuff that you touch? How did you get in? And then what makes you stay?
Yeah, honestly, it really started way back in the day in the 1990s. So I'm dating myself there, but I took a class my junior year of high school on psychology. And I loved it. And I knew immediately that's what I wanted to study. So I went to the University of Kansas. And my favorite class at KU was the psychology of hope. It was actually taught by Rick Snyder, who I didn't know at the time is like the godfather of hope. And I absolutely fell in love with it. I realized that hope should be at the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs before food and water and air.
Yeah.
And then I decided, okay, I want to go into a profession where I can use this information that helps humanity in some way. And I decided that HR was it. So went back to school at Ottawa University and got a master's in HR and started my HR career. And I have loved every minute of it. And in the last 15 years or so, gosh, I'm dating myself again.
we were all really there, Mark.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
I've really focused on HR technology. I really think that, especially today, the whole world is downstream of technology. Do you know what I mean? Like everything is being impacted by it, especially the world of work.
Yeah.
And I think the next decade is going to be absolutely fascinating. I think we will have no shortage of topics to talk about on our respective podcasts. So that's kind of a little bit of the backstory.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I love your show. I've listened to a few episodes. I really enjoy the diversity of folks that you have on there. And just the cool subjects you guys talk about.
Shout out to educators everywhere, right? Like, who would know that a class that might just sound interesting at some juncture would impact your whole entire professional life and career? Like,
no doubt. And it did.
Cool.
And you know what's funny, Julie? So I spent a couple of years living in the UK a few years ago. So I was in London for a few years and then Edinburgh. And while I was over there, I realized that the University of Sussex was offering a postgraduate certificate program on the psychology of kindness and well-being at work. So I totally signed up for that, went through those classes. It was fascinating, A, to study the topic, and B, to go to school in the UK, which was very different than the US, admittedly. It took some time to get used to it. But yeah, there's just, again, no shortage of interesting things to learn about and talk about when you talk about the world of work.
Yeah. It's funny. My daughter has a degree in psychology as well. And the entire time in school, I was like, you're going to end up in HR. You're going to end up in HR. It's perfect alignment. And she was like, no, I don't think so. And the funny thing was, right out of college, she went to UMass Lowell. She actually went to work for UKG. Back then it was Kronos, the Kronos side. Mm-hmm. Kronos is located there. They do a lot of recruiting out of her school. And I was like, see, I knew it. She's a realtor now. But, the thing is, and it's perfect for technology as well, right? The psychology of using and engaging with technology. So it doesn't surprise me that that's where how you landed here through that path. So, yeah. So look, I wanted to kind of talk about this concept, right? Because I think there are some, who will say, look, hope, right? Like, what's the saying? Like, hope's not a strategy. I was in the military, so that probably is where I learned that. But the thing is like, but there is a certain amount of spirituality and faith and all of that that's rooted in that sort of hope element. And I think we do have to have something to orient around that's like bigger than us and where we're headed and what we're trying to, maybe accomplish with our lives. But it's a very abstract subject, hope, right? Like, how do you kind of define it? How do you think about it? Like, what have you learned so far in your show? And by the way, if folks haven't checked out Hope at Work, it's on the Work Defined Network. Marcus is a peer in that network is with us, and you should take a look. I'll make sure we give you the links to all that. But yeah, Marcus, tell me about that. Like, what got you into this, and why do you, what have you learned so far with it?
Yeah, it's been interesting. So when I decided to revisit the topic of hope about 3 years ago, I just kind of forgot about how interested I was in it. And I said, okay, I need to dust this off and think about it again. So I created a newsletter out on LinkedIn. So it's the Hope at Work newsletter. It's got 70 editions now. So I've
Wow.
Nice.
been pretty committed to writing about
Congrats.
500 words or so every week. And then last year, I was sharing with Julie earlier that I started the Hope at Work podcast.
Yes.
Because again, there was a lot of people that were like, you need to start a podcast. And there's, again, no shortage of interesting
Yeah.
topics, no shortage of interesting guests. So I've been doing that for a while. But then just recently, I decided to create a workplace hope assessment.
Oh,
And
okay.
the reason for that is I'm just curious about what makes people hopeful at work. So let me back up for a minute, Pete.
Yeah.
So think about this with me. We, as humans, spend the majority of our lives at work,
Yep.
right? Now, I don't know about you, but I don't talk to that many people that are super positive about work, right? So, yeah, and you hear it in the media, right? Like everybody complains about Monday and they're just living for the weekend. And I'm like, that's awful. That is not how it should be. I think we should enjoy ourselves at work. We should be good at it. That we should find meaning and purpose in it. I think the next generation really pushes for that.
Yep.
So I said, you know what? I want to create this assessment to see what makes people hopeful or not hopeful at work. So I just
Yeah.
put it out there recently. But back to one of the questions you asked a few minutes ago, Pete, you asked, like, how do you define hope?
Yeah.
Because to your point, you do hear those hardliners that are like, hope is not a strategy. And I'm
Yeah.
like, no, it's not. It's way more important than a strategy.
Right. Right.
More.
It's foundational.
That's what
to-
we're taught.
Exactly. It is. But it's foundational to everything. So the way I define it, Pete,
Yeah.
I define hope as the active belief in a better future. And I want to emphasize a couple words there. Active is key because someone asked me recently, what's the difference between hope and optimism?
Mm-hmm.
And optimism is being positive, which is a wonderful thing, but you're not active in it. You're just like, okay, there's something that I'm positive about in the future. Hope, you have a role to play.
Yeah.
You have an action to take. You have to do something about it.
Yep.
And you also have to have the belief that you can do something about it, right?
Right.
The agency of it.
Yeah.
And then I kept it pretty broad in terms of the active belief in a better future, because better doesn't necessarily mean at work that Julie wants to be promoted to that next level or make tons of money. It could be something totally different. Maybe she's
Mhm.
really passionate about something and her better future is getting to spend time doing that versus making tons of money or getting promoted to VP.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that way we've got some flexibility. I don't know. What's your reaction to that?
No,
Yeah.
I would totally agree. I mean, again, being in the military, I definitely saw, the abstract meeting with the tactical, right? And hope is a huge thing. I think there's a lot of spirituality in that world, and I agree with you on that. I think there's a certain amount of and I wonder where this intersects with purpose and passion and all that, right? I mean, there is some of that overlap there as well. It's something to drive you, I guess, is what I think you're talking about. And I think that whatever that is that motivates you to do what you do and be who you are, that should translate to work. You're spending so much of your time there. I completely agree with that.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
what's interesting about it to me is, I relate to, what is the thing that it makes it better for you, and having a little bit of attention deficit disorder myself. Like, I like to be involved in lots of stuff and very dynamic, and that's not everybody, and it's not for every stage of life either, right?
Yeah.
And it's not for every generation. So there are elements of that I think really help people understand or relate to the different generations in the workforce,
Yeah.
or being a compassionate leader and inspiring trust and, authenticity and really just being in tune with what
Yep.
is that better for, everyone.
Yeah. The one thing too that I've seen, and I try not to bring up the pandemic so much anymore. I think we've all kind of moved past that, but I think we also recognize that post-pandemic, I think a lot of us are a little bit more willing to acknowledge that the line between our personal lives and our professional lives may have moved a little bit during the pandemic. And we're a little bit more open to the idea of recognizing that we bring our whole selves to work. And so the thing that I guess bothers me about the topic of hope is that it's not very prominent in our vernacular. We don't talk about it at work.
No, I
Well,
know.
why not? I think we can. I think we should.
Yeah.
In fact, I did see Gallup did some research recently. This was just like 2 weeks ago. And they asked, of course, a bunch of people questions about what do you really need? What do you really want from leaders? And you know what was number one on the list? Hope.
Wow.
So again, I think it can and it will become a more prominent topic. I
Yeah.
think it's going to require folks like us talking about it, maybe putting more definition around it, maybe doing some, again, of these assessments. I actually called Gallup after that and said, hey, you guys want to do like a workplace hope assessment? And they actually returned my call. So
That's
we'll see
cool.
if anything goes
That's
anywhere
cool.
there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I do think it's relevant to all of us. It has,
Yeah.
universal applicability. It's foundational for everything that we do in the workplace. And I think it's really important that we have a bit more of a positive orientation. And I think that next generation, I try not to make too many generalizations about the generations, despite how fun it is. But I do think they have, a different set of expectations. And I think they'll
Yeah.
embrace this concept.
Yeah. I think that's part of maybe part of the formula for the 5 generations in the workforce. We're all coming for some different motivator or lens of why we're at work. We all need money, obviously, but we're there for a different purpose and a reason. And I think that hope maybe is a compass to orient around as well, just like the purpose and getting people all on the same page. So
It's a change agent too, because, even having transversed a few different stages where your focus changes and what is hope and what is better, I didn't anticipate probably any of them very well, as I was living the experience. And then when you get into the next phase or you're doing something different, it's like, whoa, like my
Yeah.
whole lens has shifted. And just being familiar with that also gives you a little bit of a boost for being a change agent unto yourself, right? And
Yeah.
getting your mindset wrapped around, hey, even I'm changing. My better has changed. My hope has changed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder, Marcus, have you thought about maybe a framework, a hope framework? Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And that's kind of it's funny. I've got a friend of mine that's been on my podcast that has decided to make trust his big thing. So he created his own organization called Trust Centric. He created a trust framework. Basically,
Nice.
trust is based on how much do you care, how competent are you, and how good are you at problem solving, right?
Yep.
So he created the framework and an assessment and then some interventions and some workshops. And so I'd love to emulate him.
Yeah, we need
Yeah.
it. We need it.
We do. So, and that's part of what the assessment was meant to do. There's 10 questions in the assessment plus some demographic ones to kind of tease out what makes people hopeful or not hopeful. Because again, as you pointed out earlier, Pete, everybody's different. But there are some core essential elements to it that I think if we use an assessment like this, we'll get a better sense for an individual or even an entire organization and where they're maybe lacking in hope and what we can do about it. For example, I think control and agency is one of those big topics at work, especially for the frontline workforce.
Yeah.
I feel like the frontline workforce has almost been ignored and forgotten about when it comes to the world of technology. The big technology vendors haven't just focused on them. They focus on the people sitting at a desk tapping all day.
Right.
And I think for a lot of them, for example, like my daughters are now in the workforce. They're 21 and 20. Hard to imagine.
I know.
And they are, they've complained about not having control over their schedule.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And not having control over the actual work that they do. So, I mean, that's just, one of the examples, I think, that where people want to be able to have some semblance of control over their lives. And when they do, it has an impact on, their point of view about it. And so that's like one of, probably several, different elements of a framework that I think we could create.
Yeah.
But again, it's kind of early days. What I noticed, Pete, is when I started revisiting this topic again and looking back at Rick Snyder's research, and I grabbed my old book that I had from him, there's not been a whole lot of additional research done. There's not been a whole lot of discussion about it. So maybe we can influence it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very abstract and spiritual to a lot of folks. But one of the things I actually kind of think about this in the context of work, right? And I'll use a polarizing example without necessarily using names here. But let's just think about what's going on in America right now, right? There's a lot of polarization for our new change of government.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, I bet you, and even in the elections too, I bet you we're all hopeful for the same outcomes. We're all hoping that America does well. We're all hoping America stays safe. We're all hoping for a lot of the same exact outcomes, but oddly, we're not necessarily in agreement, definitely not in agreement about how we get to that answer.
Yeah.
And there's no right or wrong, right? There's just many multiple ways of doing that. And why can't work be the same? I think that's the same thing at work, right? Like we're all probably working towards the same common goal, same hopeful outcomes, but are we necessarily doing it with the same lens? No. And are we doing it through the same, and that lens is shaped by what we want personally or need. And, but we can all agree that the outcome has to end up being the same thing, right? And we're hopeful for that. So how do we come together and do that? So I think there's a lot of opportunity here for business leaders to potentially, right? And if you can frame it and measure it, and that's a hard part, right? Measuring it, there is a way for this to be maybe an enabler to good outcomes, positive outcomes, hopefully for the business.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah.
I think, again, we recognize that there are nuances and differences between the generations.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of commonality too. And I think that's what you're alluding to, Pete.
We want the same things probably at the end.
I think we do. I think, again, that we may prioritize and sequence some of those things a little bit differently from one generation to the next. I mentioned that the newest generation might have a little bit more of a willingness to forego titles and money for autonomy and flexibility and to have, again, meaning and purpose in the work that they do. But at the end of the day, we all have to live. We all have to pay our bills. Most of us aren't independently wealthy just yet. So the monetary, portion of this, the payroll portion, Pete, is really important.
That's right. Yeah.
So, but I do think we want the same things.
Yeah.
I wonder if it wouldn't also apply to some dimension of, when you're onboarding or joining organizations, there's often the personality tests or whatever they use to try to describe my style versus your style.
It's Myers.
Myers or any of those types of things. And that's just another one of the lenses that really shapes how you look at hope or how I look at hope or how to get there, as you say, where we're all probably looking at something similar in outcomes, but just are not on the same page, right?
Yeah. No, Julie, that's big. You're right. And so, I actually work for a company called Infor. And this is not meant to be an infomercial, pardon the pun. But we have one of those assessments. It's called Talent Science. We've assessed 200 million people so far.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a lot of data.
It is.
And the whole point is to better understand each individual and their behavioral DNA so that we can absolutely customize and personalize their experience at work.
Yeah.
Which I think, again, that next generation, they've got every app on the world on their phone.
Yep.
And they expect that level of consumerism, in their personal lives. And they're starting to expect it in the workplace too, right?
Yeah.
They want to be able to personalize their job, their work, where they work, when they work, how they work, in some cases, why they work.
Yeah.
And so I do think, Julie, you're right, that is going to become a lot more prominent in the next decade.
Yeah.
And again, it also bleeds into how the world of work itself is going to change. It's going to become less about jobs, more about tasks and transactions. I don't know if you've read that Deloitte Human Capital Trends report. I think it was the 23 one that talked about the end of jobs, not meaning we're not going to have jobs, but saying we're going to stop hiring people for jobs and say, no, we're going to hire you, Julie, to do these 10 tasks. And then when you're done with that, we'll have you do some other stuff. So I think that's where things are going to get really interesting because now you're seeing AI say, well, I can do 7 of those 10 tasks for you.
Yes.
Don't you want to do something different? And some people are like, yes, that sounds great. And other people are like, no, I already know how to do those 7 tasks. I don't want to do something different.
Yeah. Well, you nailed it with what I would call flexibility enablers. I was just talking with a vendor client of mine yesterday about how that's so critical now for people to be able to have the autonomy to pick and choose the things that make sense for them, whether it's the schedule they work or the tasks they work on or the timing of their pay or the benefits they take or whatever that is. Those things can shape an experience that is unique to them, that they decide, and they have autonomy and empowerment over that. And I think that to me, from my research and what I see, is far more powerful than any dollar amount you can give someone. It's more about how much control you can give them to customize their experience. And it's invaluable.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
look, like when I think about that and how you're talking about AI and the opportunities, not all workers are going to be fulfilled by doing the disjointed in between tasks, right? So from an experience perspective, we're looking at end-to-end experience. But when you start talking about my job satisfaction, it might make me much less satisfied to feel like I'm just coming in and, these partial bits, and I never get to see the whole picture of an experience or a task or a job or, something that I'm doing. And some folks will love it, like you say, and some folks, will be like, well, this just makes me miserable because I don't see the impact that I have on the client or the employee or whoever.
Yeah. No, you're totally right. It's funny that you say that. I was just talking to a colleague of mine who she used to work for a medical device manufacturer. So it was a manufacturing environment. So there's people on a line putting pieces together. And what they did in order to combat what you just described was twice a year, they actually brought the patients that benefited from the medical devices that they were making to the facility, and they interacted with them, and they got to hear their story about how their lives were changed as a result of the devices that you sit all day and manufacture. And it created that connection, right?
Yeah.
And again, I think we need that. The other thing that you said earlier, Julie, is you talked about how things are changing so quickly too. And I think that's an important consideration. Pete, you've probably heard the VUCA term, right? The volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And that's the world we live in. So we've got to be able to adapt and embrace these new ways of working and these new almost societal norms. But some of them are going to be hard to break through. I'll give you two examples. One is the 4-day week. I'm like a huge proponent. I've already gone to my boss and said, I'm willing to be a guinea pig. And he's like, I'm sure you are. That's okay. But it's got legs, man. It's going to take off. And then the second,
it's been around and it works.
It does work.
It does work. Yeah.
The second one is just the way that we get our health benefits. So when I was living in the UK, I was part of the NHS. I had private insurance too, but I saw socialized medicine in action, and I am not necessarily advocating for it by any stretch. But the reality is, back to your point, Julie, of us working, maybe transactional tasks, and maybe in the future, this portfolio career really takes off and it's all gig work. But if you have to get at least 30 hours to get health benefits, how in the world, with the majority of us getting our health benefits from our employer, is that going to work? If none of us work that much for any one employer. So there's societal structures that have to be kind of rethought if we're going to embrace some of these new ways of working that I do believe AI and new technologies are going to force at some point.
Yeah.
That is
that's
such
a great point.
Cool angle to that, Mark. I mean, like that I wouldn't have thought of without you bringing that into the conversation. And,
well, it's funny, like my daughters, they're starting their careers now, but they may look back and be like, Dad, I can't believe you only had one job. How dangerous was that? What if you got fired? You guys were nuts back then. Because they'll all be like, hey, we've got, 3 different gigs and they're selling stuff on Etsy and they're driving for Uber or whatever all at the same time.
Yeah. And, Mark, I did a Gen Z issue with my son who was talking about his first work experience and the trade-offs in maybe a larger, more stable job. And for him, being a Gen Z, the value of the different flexibilities that were offered there and how that literally came together in one pie. And, he knew how he weighted things. And I have another son who doesn't weight them the same. But it's a real thing, especially when you're just starting out and you don't know what to expect from the workforce, right? Mm-hmm. And so you're really just contemplating all these things.
Yeah. No, that's good stuff. So I want to kind of pivot us a little bit, if you don't mind, to your newsletter. Please. Marcus, you have a great newsletter. I'm going to share that out. I think you have some excellent points there. One of the things that really resonated with me that I think is completely lost, and I'm actually, I'm working on a very special personal project, and I'm exploring this a little bit myself in a different angle. But you had this post about practice, that we don't perform practice at work anymore, or maybe we never did. I don't know. That really resonated. And you referenced the 10,000 hour rule with Malcolm Gladwell from Outliers, which I think maybe most people are probably familiar with. I have seen the 10,000 hours in action and actually had conversations with experts in their fields over the course of my life, in the military, in martial arts, in sports and other areas. I know some pro athletes I'm friends with. And they all very much agree. When I asked, do you agree? Would you agree with the 10,000 hour rule? And they're like 100%, 100%. Every one of them say that. And so I just want to talk about that, because I think there's actually another part of this that's missing in the workplace as well. One of the things that we've also gotten away from that I think is really, really important is we've in some way demonized competition. And I think I know there is a healthy competition. You got to manage it. You have to have the right culture for it, but you can have healthy competition. And I think practice could go part and, play a role in that. But I want to talk about that. I want to get your point of view on what motivated you to write that, and kind of what your point of view is on this whole practice lacking thing, and how could we maybe bring that into the world and what it could do for us.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I hope your personal project is a book. I'm waiting for that, Pete. So, when we talk about practice, that whole kind of concept came from, I played sports growing up, right? I played soccer in college. And so I always had that kind of orientation around a coach, right, who wants you to get better and is going to push you to reach your full potential, and the utilization of practice to actually bring that to life. And it's funny because, a lot of us work for software companies that sell software. And so I work a lot with our sales teams and people in the field. And it's a very much a win or lose kind of environment, just like in sports. Did you win the game or did you lose it?
Yeah.
And so did you win the deal or did you lose it? And what's maddening to me is you don't see a whole lot of practice leading up to that interaction with that prospect. Okay, who's going to do what? And when are we going to do it? And how are we going to do it? And this is going to be our strategy. And this is the theme. And then maybe you lose the deal. And what you should do then is spend the next week figuring out, how do we change our strategy? How do we do things differently? But you don't. You just move on to the next one.
Yep.
And you make the same mistakes. And so it's maddening to me that practice isn't part of kind of the culture of companies more so. And then also in practice, what you get to do is you get to maybe try some new things, create some new plays, do things, in a different way, see if it works in practice. And then you can try it in the real world with live bullets or live, shots. But again, I for some reason, it doesn't seem to have been embraced as much. And I think I've been talking to people about this. And the main reason that I've heard people come back to me and say, why it's not that prominent is because we don't have time for it, or we don't make time for it. What do you think?
I was going to ask you, do you think it's a time issue or a discipline issue? I actually think it's a little bit of both. I also think it's a culture issue, because I don't think that a lot of leaders, I think there's a lot of leaders would be fearful of trying to do some of these things. And I think there are certainly going to be resistors, but I actually think, it is probably a time thing. It's an extra expense to have people spending time doing reps that aren't going to create, in theory, direct value immediately. Long term, they will. But I think it's a skill set. I just woke up Siri. It's a skill set issue with the leadership, and it's also, I think, just a mindset issue. It's a cultural mindset issue. So, you hear Siri?
Yeah.
Yes.
No, I think you're right, Pete.
Yeah.
I think the main reason that people will point to is the time, right? And they're like, look, we don't have time to sit and practice every conversation that we're going to have with a client.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to make do. But I didn't think about the discipline piece too. And that's where, again, maybe we have an opportunity for more standardization and consistency in how things are done. But the other thing that you end up missing out on, I think, is then innovation from the field as well, where they can. So I'll give you another sports analogy. I will readily admit and happily admit I'm a Kansas City Chiefs fan. Okay.
All right.
And one of the things that Andy Reid's done a nice job of is with folks like Patrick Mahomes and others is he says, you guys come to me with plays. You want to put something crazy in, you guys are running around in a circle holding hands, and then you go out and you do some crazy play,
Yeah.
I'll try it. And if it works, let's do it. And again, if you don't have that freedom and flexibility, the cultural element that you alluded to, Pete,
Yeah.
that you can then figure out and practice, then you're never going to try it in a game. And we don't do that.
True.
You
Yeah,
know
go
what
ahead, Julie.
what this makes me think about is, kind of the trend from a skills and an internal mobility perspective in organizations, right? Where we're trying to find ways to invite exposure to different roles or different jobs. And I'm fairly certain in all of that is starting to now permeate into the workplace. There is no 10,000 hour threshold, right?
Yeah.
And it's a little bit like what we see, or what I observed with my kids, where they want to jump from thing to thing and they expect to be good at it right out of the gate. I think that's just part of being a child and growing up and becoming more mature. But when you start to do that then as an adult and, kind of encourage, that and don't match it with some threshold of materiality to be able to be good, like, do we risk squashing hope?
Yeah.
And having folks that are getting a lot of exposure to different things, but never enough time to put in to really, really know, like, am I good at that? Do I like it? Does it
Yeah.
suck?
Yeah.
What do I do?
Yeah.
I love that, Julie.
Yeah.
Talent mobility, I think, is going to be a real important topic in the next decade. I think talent scarcity is going to be our number one challenge when you look at the demographics of, some of us are getting old and going to want to retire soon, and the next generation isn't having enough babies. So it's going to be a problem. So talent mobility is a big one. It's funny, going back to when I started my career, I was the HR person for a consulting firm. Okay. It was these former Anderson guys that when Anderson went down the tubes, they started their own consulting firm. So we were doing JD Edwards and PeopleSoft and Lawson implementation. So there's some blasts from the past.
Wow.
And so I was the HR guy that was like, putting together the HR function for this consulting organization. And I saw all these people out in the field having fun and doing all this cool stuff. And I went to the president and I said, hey, I want to get out in the field. I want to try, maybe some business development work, maybe some consulting work. And he looked at me like I had three heads and was like, what are you talking about? You're our HR guy.
Yeah.
Get back in your office. And I was like, let me rephrase this. I'm going to go try business development and consulting. I can do it here for you or I can do it somewhere else. But he had pigeonholed me as the HR guy and was like, well, I can't see you doing anything differently. And that gets back to your point, Julie, of, internal mobility has to be something that we allow for and expect. And you expect people to change and grow and want to try different things.
That's right.
And if we don't give them that opportunity to do that, then obviously they're going to go find that elsewhere.
Yeah. And just breaking those linear career progression expectations that have been so ingrained in our workplace framework, and allowing that to feed, hope and success and, engagement and all of those things is, like that's where it's at. And it's not where we've been. So it's new muscle, right?
And if you look at, like, I've seen a lot of different studies, I'm sure you all have too, about why do people leave their job? And, everyone points to money and
their boss.
And then the manager, right? But the number one thing consistently that I've seen over the years is lack of growth opportunities. You know what that means? Lack of hope. I don't feel like I have a better future here at this organization. So I'm going to go somewhere else. Look at the studies, man. I'm telling you, the majority of them point to, I need something to look forward to. I don't have that here. I'm going to go find it somewhere else.
It makes me wonder if engagement surveys, right? Like where you said there's not a lot of research been done, but maybe obtusely, there's stuff that's been happening in engagement and all of that domain that hasn't been well linked to hope. It's been under the auspices of other words, growth, mobility, innovation, experiences. And at the core, maybe it all kind of, like channels back into these dimensions of hope.
Yeah. I think one of the things too, back to this whole practice thing, having been in the military, I was very fortunate. I mean, I don't know if people know this, but like in the Marine Corps, we iterate everything and we do it ad nauseum, right? And it's not so much about perfection as it is operational excellence. But what I guess I took away from that is, and when I was young, it was like, God, we're doing this again. We just trained this the other day. But like that iteration makes us, the Marine Corps, especially as small as it is, incredibly effective, incredibly agile. And the agility comes from the adjustments we make on the fly. So in other words, we may be iterating that thing 1,000 times, but what we're doing is we're testing it, right? And we're making sure that everybody has the same muscle memory, everybody has the same reaction time, everybody can do and perform the job at the same level, and we can count on that. Because if mistakes happen, if bad decisions happen, if mistakes happen, if someone isn't where they're supposed to be, trust is broken, people get killed. It's a real serious situation. What I think that gives an advantage though over the enemy or over the competition, if you want to look at it that way, is we know where the failure points are. We know what we're strong and weak at, and we have already course corrected and figured that out before we get into that situation. And even on the battlefield, the Marine Corps is excellent about coming back and saying, hey, this isn't working, right? We've got to make an adjustment. And they will adjust on the fly, but they'll come back and iterate that across all of the units to say, we learned this in this situation. Everybody needs to go and figure out how to train around that. But what I think is most important in all this, and the cultural part of this, is you said something earlier about winning and losing. There's way too much of that in the business world.
Yeah.
It needs to be win or learn. And if you look at it that way, it flips. I learned that in martial arts. They teach our kids that you didn't lose, you learned. And you're going to take that learning and you're going to go make sure that the next time you don't lose because you've fixed that gap or that problem or whatever you got beat on. So I think if we could take that mentality out of our businesses and our talent and say, listen, it's okay to fail. It's okay to not be perfect. But here's how you become perfect is the 10,000 hours, the iterating it to where it is perfect by default. And you can go out and execute with complete confidence, and you know what you're capable of, what your peers are capable of, and how to handle the moment. And that's something I think that more organizations could take away, is create a culture that allows for that think tanking and that practice and that failure behind the doors when the bullets aren't flying, so that when they are flying, this is cake, right? And the other thing we do in the military that I loved was we train, we used to say, the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war, because if this is harder than war, it's not, practice is harder than the game. It's going to be easy when you play the game.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
I am totally stealing that win or learn.
Win or learn. There's a book on that. John Kavanaugh wrote that book. Yeah, if you look him up, he's a coach. He was actually Conor McGregor's coach, and he wrote a book called Win or Learn. And I think it's I think it's something that young people really need to know at a very early age, that it's okay to fail. It's okay to lose. It's how Gary Vee does a great job of telling young people this all the time. Go test yourself. Go get in. Go be vulnerable. Go practice, right? Go get the reps. Go stretch, and you watch how fast you'll grow and how quickly you'll become the 10,000 hour expert because you've got those reps and those iterations. So, yeah, lot could be happening there. So, I want to say this. So, I do think the time issue, right, is a problem, right? Because look, if I've only got so much budget, I got to train people, and that costs me money. Like, it's like, how do you convince leaders to invest that sort of extra time now for results later? That's the hard part, I think, for people to get their head around.
But I think you already identified it, Pete, because you talked about operational excellence that was a result of, that branch of the military making that a priority. And I think we need to do the same thing.
Yeah.
I think we need to do the same thing with practice and show them that when you actually hold these practices and you create this, new way of preparing for any kind of an engagement, what impact does it have on productivity, on profit, on, the experience of the individuals? All these things can be measured.
Yeah.
And over time, are we seeing a difference? And I would bet the majority of the time, especially if it's been executed well, you will see a difference. And then you've got a definitive ROI to point to.
Yeah.
But there has to be that initial investment to allow that to happen. And that's where I think most organizations won't allow for that.
Right. And culture. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Like change, it's the first thing that gets cut, right? Because that's not,
oh my gosh.
Because getting to efficiency and proficiency and expertise is different than I just want to be efficient now. So it's hard and it's hard to
Yeah.
measure, and the answer is different for everyone. So yeah.
Yeah.
Julia, you're so right that change management, right, is what has historically been, referred to, which I hate. It's not change management. It's change enablement. It's
Enablement, yeah.
empowering people to change. But you're right. It's the first thing that's cut in an
it is.
engagement. And it's the most important element to enable people to then embrace the changes that are coming, maybe be the ones that are instigating the changes.
That's right.
And it even ties back, Pete, to what you just described around taking risks. Instead of saying, Pete, I give you permission to fail because you can't have any kind of innovation or creativity without some failure. We should not be saying that. I'm giving you permission. I'm saying I expect it.
Yeah.
I want it.
Yeah.
And instead, we take this kind of really mousy approach to it. And then, people don't believe us anyway. And they go, I don't really want to fail 5 times. And that's not going to look good.
Because they're worried about losing and not learning.
Well,
that's it.
As leaders, isn't that our responsibility? Is when somebody has a failure, you want to figure out how to encourage them in that failure. And it's me as a leader, I have to have a response that encourages not that you lost, but that how do we learn out of that? And that's not the first go-to when something's gone wrong, right?
No. Yeah. And you know what? So I would also say culturally, there's a top down, but there's also a bottom up. And the bottom up part of this is, the top down is you got to create the environment of the win or learn. You've got to create the practice environment, the iteration, the 10,000 hours, and give all those capabilities to people. But you've also got to recruit and retain and develop people that want to be taught and want to learn.
Yeah,
because there's a lot of folks that don't think that they can learn anything because they already are experts. And I think that what's the book? What Got You Here Won't Get You There. Is it Marshall Goldsmith?
Yep.
If I'm not mistaken. Fantastic book. Fantastic eye-opening book. But the point of that book is, look, there's a lot of executives and people who have made it to great successes in their own way, but they are part of their problem that will prevent them from getting to the next level. And I think that's the part, right? You've got to be able to curate and attract people who want that hope and purpose, but also are willing to say, I don't know it all, even though I'm an expert at something, and I'm willing to learn and keep iterating and becoming better and better.
Yeah, you know what? Maybe a great place to land on that point. One of the things that I asked our industrial and organizational psychologist team that owns our talent science platform, again, I mentioned earlier, we've assessed 200 million people. So there's 26 different behavioral characteristics that we've measured. And I had this guy on the podcast. And I asked him, of those, which one maybe stood out the most in terms of being a good predictor of performance and lowering turnover? And you know what the answer was? Humility. It's what you just described, Pete, is saying, I don't have all the answers. I'm intellectually curious. That was the one.
Yeah. It starts with the leaders. They have to be the ones to lead that way and say, this is the culture here. We're all going to be open and honest about our strengths and weaknesses and try to fill them. So yeah, I love it, man. Marcus, this is probably one of the coolest conversations. I love this, man. I hope we can do it again. I know your time is constrained here, but where can everyone connect with you? And I'll make sure all the links go in. But where can we get you?
Yeah, obviously on LinkedIn, workplacehope.com is the site that I'm trying to get some traffic to take this assessment and see what kind of statistics we can come up with and what we can learn from. And then to your point, Pete, maybe we can create a hope competency model. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
But thank you for having me on the show. Really enjoyed the conversation with you and Julie.
Yeah, likewise. It's been fantastic. Maybe we can bake some of this into technology, man, turn it into a product someday. So
I think we can.
I know. I love it. Well, thank you so much. It's always been awesome. Good to see you, Julie. And we'll talk soon, Marcus.
Sounds great.